Judge orders veteran to remove medal before testifying what happens next ends his career. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7B buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the polished oak of the judge's bench. Staff Sergeant Mason Howe, 62, stood ramrod straight at the plaintiff's table, his weathered hands resting lightly on its surface. The Purple Heart medal pinned to his lapel caught the light, its purple and gold, a stark contrast against his modest gray suit, the only suit he owned, purchased 15 years ago for his daughter's wedding. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Klay Rutled," announced the bailiff. Judge Rutled swept into the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly as he climbed the 3 steps to his bench. At 47, he was the youngest judge in the district, appointed just 18 months ago after a meteoric rise through the prosecutor's office. His reputation for efficiency and strict adherence to procedure had earned him the nickname Rulebook Rutled among the courthouse staff. Mason Howe had never intended to be in this courtroom. After 22 years of military service, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, where an IED had left him with a traumatic brain injury and 40% hearing loss, he had expected a peaceful retirement. But the Veterans Affairs Housing Program had denied his application for low-income veterans housing, citing a technicality. His disability rating had been recorded as 38% instead of 40% in one of his many files. The minimum threshold was 40%. For 6 months, Mason had navigated a labyrinth of bureaucracy, filing appeals, submitting medical records, and waiting on hold for hours with various VA departments. Each time, he was told the correction was being processed, yet the denial remained in place. Meanwhile, his modest pension barely covered rent for his 1-bedroom apartment, leaving little for food and nothing for his medications. Today was his last hope, a hearing. Before Judge Rutled to compel the VA to correct his records and approve his housing application before the eviction notice on his apartment door became reality in exactly 7 days. What Mason didn't know was that Judge Rutled had already heard 3 VA cases that morning, each one taking valuable time from his crowded docket. His patience was wearing thin, and he had little sympathy left for what he viewed as yet another administrative dispute that shouldn't have reached his courtroom. Case number 2021 CV 4873, Howe versus Department of Veterans Affairs, the clerk announced. Plaintiff seeks injunctive relief regarding housing benefits denial. Mason's attorney, Sarah Lowell, a young public interest lawyer working pro bono, rose to her feet. "Your Honor, we're asking for emergency relief. My client is facing eviction in 1 week due to an administrative error in his disability rating." Judge Rutled peered over his reading glasses. "Ms. Lowell, the court calendar is not dictated by your client's housing situation. The VA has procedures for these matters." "Yes, Your Honor, but Mr. Howe has exhausted all administrative remedies. The VA acknowledges the error, but claims the correction process takes 3 to 6 months. He doesn't have that kind of time." The judge sighed audibly. "Very well. Call your first witness." The plaintiff called Staff Sergeant Mason Howe. Mason moved to the witness stand, his slight limp a reminder of the shrapnel still embedded in his right leg. As he raised his right hand to be sworn in, the Purple Heart on his lapel caught the judge's attention. "Mr. Howe," Judge Rutled interrupted before the clerk could administer the oath, "is that a military decoration you're wearing?" Mason straightened his shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor. Purple Heart, awarded in 2009 after an IED attack outside Kandahar. The judge's expression hardened. "This is a federal courtroom, not a military parade ground. Please remove the medal before testifying." A confused silence fell over the courtroom. Mason blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, Your Honor." "The medal, Mr. Howe. Remove it. It's inappropriate display in my courtroom and could prejudice proceedings." Sarah Lowell quickly intervened. "Your Honor, there's no rule prohibiting the wearing of military decorations in court. My client wears his Purple Heart as a matter of personal dignity." Judge Rutled's face flushed slightly. "Ms. Lowell, I determine what's appropriate in my courtroom. The medal is an appeal to emotion rather than fact, and I won't have it. Mr. Howe, remove the medal, or you won't testify today." Mason stood perfectly still, his mind racing. The Purple Heart had been pinned to his chest by his commanding officer as he lay in a field hospital, still groggy from surgery, with 3 of his squad members already in body bags. He had worn it to every important event since his daughter's graduation, his wife's funeral job interviews. It wasn't just a medal, it was a reminder of what he had survived and those who hadn't. "I cannot do that, Your Honor," Mason said quietly but firmly. "With all due respect, this medal represents sacrifice that I can't put into words. It honors the men who died beside me. I don't wear it to influence the court, but because it's part of who I am." The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above her stenotype machine. Judge Rutled's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Mr. Howe, I'm not asking. I'm ordering you to remove that medal before testifying. This is about courtroom decorum, not your military service." Mason remained motionless, his hand unconsciously moving to cover the medal protectively. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I cannot comply with that order." Contempt. Judge Rutled's gavel crashed down with such force that several people in the gallery jumped. "The witness is held in contempt of court. Bailiff, remove that medal and take Mr. Howe into custody." Before the bailiff could move, Sarah Lowell was on her feet. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to confer with my client." "Denied, Ms. Lowell. Your client has made his choice." From the back of the courtroom, a man in a dark suit stood up. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." Judge Rutled glared at the interruption. "And you are James Merrick, Department of Justice, Veterans Affairs Division. I'm here representing the defendant." "Mr. Merrick, unless you're objecting to your opponent's witness being held in contempt, sit down." Merrick remained standing. "Actually, Your Honor, I am objecting. The VA has no issue with Mr. Howe wearing his military decoration. In fact, we believe asking him to remove a Purple Heart is problematic." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even opposing counsel was siding with Mason. In the second row of the gallery, a young woman in her 20s had been quietly filming the proceedings on her phone against courtroom rules. Courtney Patel, a law student observing cases for a class assignment, had been live streaming to a small legal education group. But as the confrontation escalated, her viewership numbers had begun climbing rapidly. Judge Rutled, unaware of the digital audience growing by the second, was faced with a decision. Backing down would undermine his authority, but pressing forward was clearly creating a situation that extended beyond a simple matter of courtroom decorum. "Your objection is noted, Mr. Merrick," the judge said coldly, "but my ruling stands. Mr. how this is your final opportunity to comply before I have you removed from my courtroom. Mason, how stood unwavering, his eyes locked with the judge's. Sir, I've faced enemy fire. I've been blown up and put back together. I've buried friends. With all due respect, there is nothing you can do to me that would make me dishonor their memory by removing this medal. The bailiff, a veteran himself, approached Mason with visible reluctance. Sir, he said quietly, please don't make me do this. Outside the courtroom, Courtney's live stream had jumped from her original 15 viewers to over 3,000. Comments were flooding in, many from veterans expressing outrage. Someone had identified Judge Rutled by name, and the hashtag #respect. The Purple Heart was already trending locally. Inside, unaware of the digital storm brewing, Judge Rutled made a fateful decision. Bailiff escort Mr. Howe to holding. Ms. Lowell, your client will spend 24 hours in custody for contempt, after which he may purge his contempt by complying with my order. This hearing is continued until tomorrow morning. As the bailiff reluctantly led Mason toward the door, the veteran turned to face the judge one last time. I'll be wearing this medal tomorrow too, Your Honor, and the day after that, and at my eviction. And if I end up homeless under a bridge, I'll still be wearing it then. The quiet dignity in his voice silenced the room. Even Judge Rutled seemed momentarily taken aback by the calm certainty of a man who had clearly faced worse than a night in a holding cell. By the time Mason reached the courthouse steps in handcuffs, Courtney's live stream had over 50,000 viewers. News vans were already pulling up to the curb. By 7 p.m. that evening, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Every major news network was running the story, Judge orders Purple Heart recipient to remove medal or face jail. Veterans groups across the country were organizing protests outside the courthouse for the following morning. The hashtag #respect the Purple Heart was the #1 trending topic nationally. In the judicial holding facility, Mason sat on a bench declining offers from 3 different high-profile attorneys who had shown up offering to represent him pro bono. Ms. Lowell is my lawyer, he insisted. She's been with me from the beginning. Sarah Lowell, meanwhile, was working frantically preparing emergency motions and fielding calls from media outlets and veterans advocacy groups. Among those calls was one from Senator James Harrington, a decorated Marine veteran who chaired the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. This is a disgrace, the senator told her. I'm flying in tonight. I want to be in that courtroom tomorrow morning. Judge Rutled was having dinner with his wife when his phone began buzzing incessantly. First came a call from the chief judge of the district, then from the State Bar Association president, and finally from the governor's office. Each conversation grew increasingly tense as he defended his position. Courtroom decorum was his prerogative as judge, and no one, veteran or otherwise, was above the rules of his courtroom. Klay, his wife said, after the third call, maybe you should watch the video. What video? She handed him her tablet, where Mason Howe's quiet dignity played out against Judge Rutled's increasingly hostile demands. The comments below were scathing, many calling for the judge's removal from the bench. For the first time, Judge Rutled saw the scene through others' eyes, not as a matter of courtroom authority, but as a powerful man demanding that a wounded veteran dishonor his sacrifice and fallen comrades. His stomach tightened as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. His phone rang again. This time, it was his father, a Vietnam veteran, who had never fully approved of his son's choice to pursue law instead of military service. "Dad, I can explain." "No, son, you can't," came the gravelly voice. "That medal isn't just a piece of metal. It's blood. It's sacrifice. It's brothers who never came home. You've always been so damn sure of yourself, so convinced of your own rightness. But you're wrong on this one, Klay. Dead wrong." The call ended, leaving Judge Rutled staring at his reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in his career, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Dawn broke over a courthouse surrounded by hundreds of veterans, many in uniform, many wearing their own medals and decorations. News cameras captured the scene as veterans of every age, from Tabeo II to Afghanistan, stood in silent formation, creating a path from the judicial holding facility to the courthouse steps. Inside, Judge Rutled arrived early, slipping through a side entrance to avoid the crowd. In his chambers, he met with the chief judge and the court administrator. "This has become a national incident," Klay, the chief judge, said gravely. "Veterans groups are filing judicial complaints. The governor has called twice. You need to find a way to diffuse this situation." "I was enforcing courtroom decorum," Rutled insisted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Decorum." The chief judge shook his head. "There is no rule against wearing military decorations in court. In fact, there's a long tradition of veterans doing exactly that when testifying. You created this problem out of thin air." As 9 a.m. approached, Mason Howe was led from the holding facility. When he emerged into the morning light, the assembled veterans snapped to attention, rendering a silent salute as he walked between their ranks. The Purple Heart still gleamed on his lapel. Inside the packed courtroom, Judge Rutled took the bench's face a careful mask of judicial impassivity. In the gallery sat Senator Harrington, along with the State Veterans Affairs Director and representatives from a dozen veterans organizations. News cameras had been permitted, an unusual allowance that signaled the exceptional nature of the proceedings. "Before we begin," Judge Rutled said, his voice carefully modulated, "I want to address yesterday's events. Upon reflection and research, I recognize that military decorations, particularly those awarded for combat wounds, such as the Purple Heart, hold a special significance that transcends ordinary courtroom considerations." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "Therefore, I am vacating the contempt order against Mr. Howe. He is, of course, permitted to wear his military decoration while testifying." Sarah Lowell rose. "Your Honor, while we appreciate that clarification, my client spent the night in custody for refusing to do something he had every right to do. We believe a more formal acknowledgement is appropriate." Judge Rutled's jaw tightened momentarily. Apologizing went against every instinct he had developed in his career. Judges didn't apologize. They ruled. Before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened and an elderly man in a wheelchair was escorted in by a court officer. Judge Rutled froze as he recognized his father himself, a decorated Vietnam veteran, being positioned in the front row of the gallery. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in his father's gaze, Judge Rutled saw not anger, but disappointment, a look that cut deeper than any rebuke. In that moment, something shifted within Judge Rutled. This wasn't about his authority or saving face. It was about recognizing a fundamental truth that his legal education and judicial career had somehow failed to instill that some principles transcend procedural rules and some honors are earned in ways that courtroom protocols can never fully comprehend. "Mr. Howe," Judge Rutled said, addressing the veteran directly, "I owe you an apology. My order yesterday was inappropriate and reflected a failure to understand the profound significance of the honor you wear. The Purple Heart represents a sacrifice that demands respect in this courtroom and everywhere else. I sincerely apologize for my error and for the discomfort and indignity you experienced as a result." The courtroom fell silent, stunned by the unprecedented apology from the bench. Mason nodded once, accepting the apology with the same quiet dignity with which he had refused to remove his medal. "Now," Judge Rutled continued, "regarding the matter that brought us here, originally your housing application, I've reviewed the file overnight. The evidence clearly shows that your disability rating should be 40%, not 38%. The VA's failure to correct this administrative error in a timely manner has created an unnecessary hardship." He turned to the VA representative. "Mr. Merrick, is there any reason why this correction cannot be made immediately? And Mr. Howe's housing application approved today?" Merrick, sensing the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere, stood quickly. "No, Your Honor. In fact, I've been authorized to expedite both the correction and the housing approval. We can have Mr. Howe's paperwork processed by the end of business today." Judge Rutled nodded. "So ordered. Mr. Howe will receive written confirmation of his approved housing application by 5 p.m. today. Additionally, the VA will cover any costs associated with extending his current lease until the new housing is ready for occupancy." He paused, then added, "And the court will personally cover the cost of Mr. Howe's night in custody, as well as any related expenses." As the hearing concluded, Mason Howe stood to leave. As Mason Howe stood to leave, Judge Rutled did something unprecedented in his judicial career. He stepped down from the bench and approached the veteran. "Staff Sergeant Howe," he said, extending his hand, "may I speak with you privately for a moment?" Mason glanced at Sarah Lowell, who nodded slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." The two men walked to a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, followed by curious glances from everyone present. Once inside, Judge Rutled closed the door and took a deep breath. "My father is the man who just came in, the Vietnam veteran in the wheelchair." He began gesturing toward the courtroom. "Last night was the first time in 20 years he's told me he was disappointed in me. He said something I can't stop thinking about. You never had to bleed for anything you believe in." Mason remained silent, his expression neutral. "He's right," Rutled continued. "I've spent my career enforcing rules without always understanding their purpose or their limits. Yesterday, I confused authority with respect." He paused, struggling visibly with his emotions. "My father has a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. Growing up, I never understood why he kept them in a drawer instead of displaying them. Last night, he told me it was because medals aren't for showing off. They're reminders of the worst days of your life and the people who didn't come home." Mason's expression softened slightly. "Your father sounds like he understands." "He does, and I didn't. Not until I saw you willing to go to jail rather than dishonor what that medal represents." Rutled hesitated, then asked, "May I ask what happened when you earned it?" Mason was quiet for a long moment. "Route clearing operation outside Kandahar. Our vehicle hit an IED. 3 of my men died instantly. I pulled the 4th out before a secondary device detonated." He touched the medal unconsciously. "I wear this for them, not for me." Staff Sergeant Williams had 3 kids. Corporal Diaz was going to propose to his girlfriend when he got home. Private First Class Miller was just 19. Judge Rutled nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "Thank you for telling me, and thank you for your service words I know are inadequate, but they're sincere." As they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as a confrontation had become something else, a moment of recognition and reconciliation that transcended the legal dispute. Senator Harrington approached as they emerged. "Judge Rutled, Staff Sergeant, how I believe something important has happened here today. With your permission, I'd like to invite both of you to testify before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee next week. We're considering legislation regarding the treatment of veterans in the judicial system, and I think your experience could be invaluable." Judge Rutled looked surprised. "Senator, I'm not sure I'm the right person." "Actually," Harrington interrupted, "you might be exactly the right person. Someone who's learned a lesson the hard way often has the most valuable perspective." Mason nodded in agreement. "I'd be willing to testify, Senator. If my experience can help other veterans, then something good will have come from this." As they left the courthouse together, they were met by a sea of veterans still standing in formation. One by one, as Mason descended the steps, they saluted not just him, but also Judge Rutled, who walked beside him, acknowledging a respect that had been earned rather than demanded. Among them was Judge Rutled's father, who raised his hand in a shaky salute from his wheelchair. The judge knelt beside him, and for the first time in decades, the 2 men embraced without reservation. Courtney Patel, the law student whose live stream had started it all, captured this moment too. But this time, instead of outrage, the comments flowing across the screen spoke of reconciliation, understanding, and the power of humility. 1 week later, Mason Howe and Judge Klay Rutled sat side by side before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. The hearing room was packed with media veterans and judicial representatives. "Gentlemen," Senator Harrington began, "thank you for appearing today. What began as an unfortunate incident has sparked a national conversation about the intersection of military service and our judicial system. Staff Sergeant, how would you please share your perspective on what occurred and what you believe needs to change?" Mason leaned toward the microphone. "Senator, what happened in that courtroom could happen anywhere, not because of malice, but because of a disconnect between those who have served and those who haven't. My Purple Heart isn't just a decoration. It represents the worst day of my life and the best men I've ever known. Asking me to remove it was like asking me to deny their sacrifice." He continued, "But I don't believe Judge Rutled intended disrespect. He simply didn't understand, and that's the larger problem. We need to address the gap in understanding between veterans and the civilian institutions we interact with after service." Judge Rutled spoke next, his testimony broadcast live on every major network. "Senators, I've been a judge for 7 years. In that time, I've prided myself on running an efficient, orderly courtroom, but last week, I confused order with respect and authority, with understanding." He paused, gathering himself. "When I ordered Staff Sergeant Howe to remove his Purple Heart, I was enforcing a rule that didn't exist for a purpose that wasn't valid. I failed to recognize that some symbols transcend courtroom decorum because they represent values that our courts themselves are designed to protect. His testimony continued, detailing how the incident had forced him to confront his own biases and limitations. I've since learned that many veterans face similar misunderstandings in courtrooms across the country. Judges who don't recognize the significance of military decorations, who don't understand the unique challenges veterans face, who don't appreciate that for many veterans their service isn't something they did, it's who they are. The committee listened intently as both men proposed specific changes, training for judges and court personnel about military culture and the significance of decorations, clear guidelines prohibiting courts from requiring the removal of military honors, and expedited procedures for veterans facing housing insecurity. 3 months later, the Valor Recognition Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The legislation prohibited courts from requiring the removal of military decorations and established training requirements for judges handling cases involving veterans. Judge Rutled, rather than being censured as many had initially demanded, became an unlikely advocate for judicial reform. He established a veterans treatment court in his district, specializing in cases involving former service members struggling with PTSD, substance abuse, and reintegration challenges. My greatest failure as a judge became my greatest opportunity to learn, he told a graduating class of law students at his alma mater. I was so focused on the rules that I forgot about justice. I was so concerned with my authority that I forgot about respect. Don't make the same mistake. Mason Howe moved into his new apartment in the Veterans Housing Complex, where he became an informal mentor to younger veterans navigating the bureaucracy of post-service life. The photograph of him standing firm in court, hand protectively covering his Purple Heart, hung in the complex's community room, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground is the highest form of respect you can show to those who no longer can. On Veterans Day, 6 months after the courtroom confrontation, Mason received an invitation from Judge Rutled. The judge was hosting a ceremony at the courthouse, dedicating a new Veterans Justice Center designed to help former service members navigate legal challenges. As Mason entered the courthouse, the same building where he had spent a night in custody for refusing to remove his medal, he found the walls lined with photographs of local veterans throughout history, their decorations prominently and respectfully displayed. Judge Rutled greeted him warmly, his father in the wheelchair beside him. "Staff Sergeant, how would you do us the honor of cutting the ribbon?" As Mason stepped forward, he noticed something on the judge's lapel, a small pin in the shape of a Purple Heart. Not the medal itself, which only recipients could wear, but a symbol of respect and understanding. "My father gave it to me," Rutled explained, seeing Mason's glance. "He said it's to remind me every day that some principles are worth standing firm for, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." Mason nodded, understanding the gesture's significance. "That's a lesson worth remembering, Your Honor." "Please," the judge said, "call me Klay." As they stood together before the crowd, Mason reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a simple housing dispute had transformed into something much more significant, a recognition that the wounds of war, both visible and invisible, deserve not just acknowledgement, but respect. The ribbon fell away and applause filled the atrium. But for Mason, the most meaningful sound was the quiet voice of Judge Rutled's father as he wheeled himself forward. "Welcome home, soldier," the old veteran said, extending his hand to Mason. "Welcome home." In that moment, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that his service, his sacrifice, and the memory of his fallen comrades were truly understood and honored, not just with words or ceremonies, but with meaningful change that would help other veterans for years to come. And for Judge Klay Rutled, the incident that could have ended his career instead transformed it, teaching him that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but understanding of the people it serves, especially those who have sacrificed to defend it. The Purple Heart on Mason's lapel caught the light as cameras flashed, no longer a point of contention, but a symbol of respect, remembrance, and reconciliation. Proof that sometimes standing firm for what's right can change not just one life, but many.